I have the honor of introducing our distinguished host. And in consideration of the time and the value of any opportunity to listen to Dr. Newman speak on subjects that are relevant to our understanding of our own story, that are relevant to having a deeper and more realistic appreciation of what's wrong with how America teaches our history to ourselves. I won't go into quite as much as might be otherwise warranted, but I would like to state something that I think is appropriate. Marshall McLuhan said, "Only the small secrets need to be protected. The large ones are kept secret by public incredulity." Dr. Newman is a figure whose influence is felt across a broad spectrum, from Western military discipline to Eastern contemplative practices. His story embraces directionality and serendipity. From the past through the present, we might acknowledge a series of extraordinary stations or places or patterns which have emerged as the direct result of Dr. Newman's life, of his efforts, and of his story. He is a retired United States Army officer, a career strategic intelligence cryptologic analyst, a distinguished historian, educator, and mentor. He's an expert on Far Eastern studies and comparative religions, and his works on America's history during the Cold War are perhaps the most consequential yet published. On November 3rd of 1994, Dr. Newman was the right person at the right time in the home of a senior desk officer, retired CIA desk officer named Jane Roman. The experience of acting really on behalf of those of us who seek to find a better, deeper, more realistic understanding of our own story was altered as the result of what happened in that lady's house. A Washington Post reporter named Jefferson Morley had invited, of all people, Dr. John Newman to accompany him to interview a lady whose name had showed up as the result of the release of an extraordinary number of CIA documents as the result of the 1992 President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. Dr. Newman agreed to accompany the Washington Post reporter, who was really consciously deferring to Dr. Newman because the reporter in question understood that he did not have a background in military intelligence. He was not knowledgeable about the infrastructure of the agency, and he would not be most qualified to discuss the intricacies that are relevant to reading and understanding what's in the documentary record. But Dr. Newman is those things. He does understand those complexities, and so it was a good day. It was a day where the right person was in the right place at the right time. It was a cordial encounter, and Ms. Roman, who had been a senior liaison officer working outside of the Counterintelligence Special Investigations Group, which was, along with its sort of counterpart inside the agency, the Office of Security, was the deepest, most compartmentally insulated place inside America's intelligence infrastructure at the peak of the Cold War. She was a senior desk officer. She wasn't responsible for protocol or policy, but she did what she was told. On October 8th of 1963, 6 weeks prior to the assassination, the CIA station in Mexico City asked a routine question of headquarters. What do we have on someone named Lee Oswald, who was just caught up in some wacky hijinks at both the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy in Mexico City the preceding week? And the response came from the desk of this lady, Jane Roman. She said, well, here's what we've got. It's mostly FBI stuff. It stops in mid-1962, and that's all we know. And this is something that was signed off on by the executives above her, all of whom we know quite well, which would be big news to those guys. 31 years later, Dr. Newman knew what to ask Ms. Roman about why she was signing off on something that was not true. He knew what to ask her because he knew what had happened. He was uniquely qualified to have the documents, to read the documents, and to understand what they revealed. And in her home, in the company of a Washington Post reporter who was recording the conversation, which ultimately was transcribed by the Washington Post transcription service, this exchange took place. Dr. Newman laid out chronologically what had happened 31 years earlier, at which point she realized where he was going. She was a very educated, supremely capable desk officer working at the highest level of the agency at the peak of the Cold War. The corners of her mouth started to come up because she saw what he was leading to. He demonstrated to her that she had been signing off on relevant documents pertaining to the agency's interest in someone named Lee Oswald as recently as literally within a few days prior to that routine inquiry from the Mexico City station. Dr. Newman ultimately asked her what her take on this was. Ms. Roman said, "I'm signing off on something that's not true." At which point Dr. Newman very calmly and with courtesy said, "But why are you doing that?" And she becomes defensive and she says, "Well, I wasn't involved in any hanky-panky." And he says, no, but there doesn't necessarily have to be a sinister explanation. The thing I guess I'm asking you to address head on here is, it's one thing if I say to you, you do not have a need to know. It's another thing if I say, here's some information in response to your question, which I know is misleading. So he continues. He said, I guess the thing I'm asking you to address head on here is, does this indicate to you an operational interest in Oswald 6 weeks prior to the assassination? What she said changed our story, but you've never heard about this. What she said that changed the way we think about what we're told and what we think we know is the following. Yes, to me it indicates a keen interest held very closely on a need-to-know basis. A keen interest held very closely on a need-to-know basis. She's referring to the executives above her within the most compartmentally insulated, most densely protected place inside the CIA 6 weeks prior to the assassination. Whatever's going on, it is all about someone named Lee Oswald. The person responsible for that exchange is sitting right here, and it's my honor to introduce Dr. John Newman.
Let's say a couple of things and I'll get started. If you leave here tonight and are not convinced that JFK was pulling out of Vietnam, I failed my job today, okay? So you will leave here totally convinced of that, I can guarantee you that. I'm not here to talk about the assassination per se. I'm not going to theorize that Kennedy's policies on Vietnam are the reason that he died, but I will tell you that the reason we went into Vietnam is because he died. If he had lived, there never would have been a Vietnam War. That's the difference, okay? That's the part that I want to talk to you about. I'm going to do it in two phases. There's going to be the road that took me to undertake the project, and then what happened to Sue and me as a result of that, which was very unpleasant, and then to take you through what was actually in the first book and things that I figured out in the second edition that was just released. I'm going to get started, and we're going to have a quick break, bathroom break, and there'll be another one about halfway through so that we can just stand up and stretch our legs so that I don't put you to sleep. Okay, let's get started with the first one. The first serendipitous event that occurred on the path to this book was actually when I received a direct commission from the ranks after about 7 years of enlisted time. I was on my way out of the Army. I had a wife and 2 kids, and halfway through my PhD program, and wanted a job with more money than a staff sergeant. And so the Army made me an offer I couldn't refuse. No OCS, overnight, straight from staff sergeant to first lieutenant. And so if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been working for that man later. General Odom, the director of the National Security Agency, when he discovered me after a couple of years of working inside the NSA main building, National Security Agency, put my desk right outside of his for about a year and a half. And I was his military assistant, and not a thing went into his office on intelligence that didn't go across my desk first. And I put a little piece of paper on the front that had 3 boxes. Yes, no, or maybe. That was my job. Okay, but anyway, everywhere he went with him, when he took his satchel with him, and he gave briefings to Kissinger's and people like that in the White House. And we were traveling one day down to a naval facility in the Carolinas, where he was going to give a presentation on his Soviet battlefield doctrine, and put his New York Times down and asked me what I was going to do my dissertation on. And I said, the political succession to Mao Zedong. And he knew I'd done a lot of work on that already, published on it. He said, oh, come on, that's too easy for you. You need to get out of your safety box and do something better than that. And so I thought for a while, and I said, well, let me ask you this, sir. If I told you that John Kennedy was pulling out of Vietnam when he was killed, there wouldn't have been a Vietnam War if he lived, how would that be for a dissertation? And he thought for a while, and he said, you know what, if you could show that, it would be great. So the plane got home that night. I called my dissertation advisor, Dr. Thornton at GW, told him what I wanted to do, and he said, I thought you'd never ask. And so getting the correct commission and getting to work for him, if those things hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here tonight. Okay, and there are a lot more things along the way that happened like that I could go into, and if they hadn't happened, we still wouldn't be here tonight. So a lot of things had to happen along the way for me to write that book and then redo it again this year. Let's go to the pause part here. I'm going to try and keep myself on track. So what I've done is to have a cheat sheet. And if I got yellow highlighted, it means go fast. And if I don't have that on it, it means I can slow down and really bring you down to ground level and let you get your teeth into some of these things I want to go into today. So, having made the decision to look into this as my dissertation, the next serendipitous event occurred at a military intelligence officer training school at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. I had been there for the basic course, and I returned a couple of years later, still working on this book with my wife. It was a PCS, it was over 6 months, and there was the Military Intelligence Museum there, and a guy by the name of Don Blasek, who was a retired colonel from the Army, intelligence officer, was running the MI Museum there. And so I went in to check it out, and we got to talking, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him what my dissertation was. He said, oh, that's when the big lie started. So Sue and I invited him over for dinner, or he invited us over for dinner, didn't he? Yeah, we went to his house. And he told us all about what happened under Westmoreland later on, all the lies that had took place in 67 and 68. And he said, but what you're looking at, the period you're looking at is where it really began. And he gave me some names, Sam Adams, a CIA guy in Washington who was part of the CBS documentary on the Westmoreland years. And Blasek was there, but he was also in Vietnam during the Kennedy period, so he knew the people that I needed to talk to find out if what he said was true, that there was all these big lies taking place during the Kennedy years. And so he sent me to Sam Adams, the CIA guy, and I talked to Sam out here in his Loudoun County farm. And Sam gave me the names of everybody else and their phone numbers and how to reach them, the officers who had been there all the way back in 1961, 62, and 63. A couple of them were very important. One's name is Bill Benedict. He was working in Army intelligence in the Pentagon. And another was George Allen. He was in charge of the Vietnam desk at the newly created Defense Intelligence Agency in 1961. I'll say more about what they, I'll mention them again, but I need to tell you this, that what they told me happened was that they had been ordered in 1962 to falsify the number of Viet Cong in the Viet Cong forces, and to cut it in half from about 50,000 to about, actually more than that, to 15,000. And they refused to do it, and so they were forced to, literally. And so one day they got a bottle of bourbon and sat down in Saigon and just started eliminating whole units. And that wasn't, and he cut it down to 20,000, and that wasn't enough. And so the colonel who was in charge of intelligence and at MACV, the Military Assistance Command of Vietnam, and the commander, General Harkins, finished the job. And I'm going to get back to that part of the story a little bit later when I get back into the book. But I met these guys who told me this story that was unbelievable for me as a military intelligence officer. You know, and I asked them, why are you telling me this? You know, because I didn't really know what to do with it. And they said, because, you know, we'd rather have one of our guys, tell this story. They wanted to get it off their chest. They were living with it, you know, and what happened in Vietnam for the rest of their lives. They were part of something that kept Kennedy from pulling out. He would have pulled out had he known the truth earlier than he did or was about to do when he died. So that was an important part of the story getting there. I had to meet Blasek, and I had, through him, to meet Sam Adams, and through him I had to meet and get all these guys that had actually been there at the time and had done this. But I realized at that moment that I had to find documents. I needed more than just their word. I needed to actually have Army documents and intelligence documents that backed up what these men told me they had done. And they suggested a small Army component in the Pacific. The Commander-in-Chief Pacific is a Navy guy, as you can imagine, as an admiral, and underneath that naval headquarters are other subordinate commands, including an Air Force, an Army, and a Navy one there, and United States Army Pacific is the Army subordinate command to CINCPAC. And they put out monthly intelligence bulletins all through this period. And so those monthly intelligence bulletins came from source material directly from Vietnam, from MACV, unfiltered. And they published their own stuff. And it didn't get outside of Hawaii except for one person. It turns out to be Vice President Johnson, which is, I'll get back to that a little bit later in the story too. But anyway, so I went to the main headquarters for Center for Military History is in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, but they have a place in Washington, D.C. on Massachusetts Avenue. So I walked in uniform one day, and there was a civilian guy there, and I said hello, and I told him who I was and that I was doing my dissertation on, and I'd heard that there were some USARPAC intelligence bulletins available, or that were classified but could be made available possibly. And he said, well, just a minute, let's go look. And he opened the safe, and sure enough, there they were, all the May 62, which was the relevant period that I needed, which was the story that these guys had told me. And he said, sure, and he declassified it right there, including the maps of Viet Cong attacks and all these sorts of things. What we call the measles map, and I'm going to be showing you those later when I get back to that part of it. This is just, I'm talking to you now about the road to all this. These are the people I met along the way, and I finally got the documents to back up the story. At which point I finished chapter 13, called Secrets in Saigon, and sent it to Robert Mcnamara, former Secretary of Defense. Part of the problem we had in understanding what had really happened in Vietnam under Kennedy, it was secret, was that the most important guy, the most important person to helping us know about that was Robert Mcnamara. And he was the only one of all the generals and civilian leaders, the defense secretaries from the United States, Australia, Vietnam, you name it. They all wrote their memoirs except for Mcnamara. He wouldn't talk. So I sent him chapter 13. And one of the subtitles in that chapter was, "We can't tell that to Mcnamara." And anyway, it upset him. It upset him a lot. And he sent me back a one-liner saying, I was never lied to. It was McNamara's denial. And I didn't see him for years after that. So I went ahead with the book and finished it up. And so we should have the NSA. Yeah, there we go. Good job. So I'm back at NSA, and I have my manuscript in hand, and I'm required to go through pre-publication review. with my component, which is the Army, and I did that. So I walked down to the Pentagon, I gave them my manuscript. They cleared it very quickly. And then I walked into NSA and went into Q Group, which has one of the responsibilities, it's a staff level, high level staff level unit. One of the things they do is pre-pub review, amongst other things. And they said, no, you're in the Army, you should go to the Army. And I said, I have, but if you don't mind, I worked here a lot. It's all the same here. And so I gave them a copy of it. And never heard anything for a long time, about 8 or 9 or 10 months. And then as the moment approached for my dissertation defense in 1992, in the fall, I was at the Command and Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. And you have groups of 16 majors going on lieutenant colonel. That's what we're there for about 4 months. So Fort Leavenworth is about an hour away from Dallas. And most of the shooting for the film JFK was done in Dallas at the big studios down there. And a guy by the name of Oliver Stone had found out through serendipity again. Story. It's in too long to tell it. But anyway, Stone found out about what I was doing and called me up. We remember the day in Leavenworth. We were wondering what to do. Stone wanted me to help him on his movie. And because his movie was going to say that Kennedy was pulling out of Vietnam, amongst other things. And so anyway, I agreed, providing that in the credits, my name would be Dr. Newman or Dr. John Newman. It would not hype my military status, and that I wouldn't talk to him about anything about the assassination, only Kennedy's Vietnam policies. He agreed, and I flew down there on the weekends, and my group of 16 were having a good time listening to my stories and coming back every Monday of each trip down to Dallas to do it. But 9 or 10 scenes in that movie came right out of JFK and Vietnam. And so as the dissertation defense approached in December, and my book and the film, we were approaching a sort of a crisis point, because 5 or 6 months before that, I was called into NSA to the legal counsel's office, and she told me that my book was classified and that it couldn't be published. And I asked why, what's classified in it? And she said, well, I don't know anything about that. And I said, well, when will I know? And she said, we don't know. And so there I was at 18 and a half years of service, with a list of security clearances. It takes a whole page to print out, because I'd worked for the director, worrying about whether I was going to have my security clearances yanked and maybe even drummed out of the court, lose my pension and everything else. And Sue and I spent a lot of sleepless nights trying to figure out what to do about that one. Eventually I decided to challenge them by just publishing the book. And I did. And so and then I went to the premiere, and Oliver Stone sent me a pair of first-class round-trip tickets and a great big free hotel room with an unlimited budget for entertainment. And Sue wouldn't go. She was afraid. She would not go. She was freaked out by this whole experience. And so I went out, and the lady had been an editor with us on Route 7. Pat Lambert, she was happy to go to the premiere with me, and I didn't do any entertaining that night. I went back to my hotel room and called Sue. We talked, because the next day was the press junket. There were a lot of technical advisors on that movie, but I was the only one that Oliver Stone kept for the press junket. What's a press junket? It's a table like this. I'm sitting there, and then there's like 12 seats, and a whole group of reporters comes in, talks to you for 20 minutes, and then the next group, and then the next group, and then the next group. Goes on for about 3 hours. It's called a press junket. And seems that the National Security Agency found out that I was going to be doing the press junket the day after the premiere, because on that morning, it was a Saturday morning at 4 o'clock my time in Los Angeles, 7 a.m. at NSA headquarters, my phone rings. Is this Major Newman? Yes. This is the National Security Agency. Your book's cleared to go. Have a nice day. And after 20 minutes of introspection, I had a very nice day. Well, that didn't end it. That didn't end it. What happened was, within a matter of a couple of months, my publisher, Warner Books, pulled the book out of the stores and hid it in a warehouse and would not return my phone calls. They suppressed my book, which is not legal. They can approach you officially and say, we'd like to take your book off the market for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years for this amount of money. And it's done a lot in Hollywood and in publishing, but not to buy my rights and and then just disappear the book. You can't do that, and not communicate about it either. So I have to leave a lot of the story out because, in the interest of time, there are a number of things that happened. But along the way, that was Warner Books. I was approached by the Galbraith family. John Kenneth Galbraith was still alive at the time. He was advised about 4 presidents, and he had 3 sons. One of whom, James Galbraith, who was, like his father, an economist teaching at the University of Texas in economics, and he had seen the book and wanted it on his syllabus for his graduate students because of the interesting blurbs on the back. You had Oliver Stone and the head of the CIA next to each other praising the book. So he thought, wow, that's interesting. So he wanted to put it on his syllabus, and his students told him that it's been suppressed. We can't get the book. So he asked me if I'd minded if the Galbraith family looked into this matter. I said, give me my rights back, and we're done. And I got the rights back to the book, and there it sat until January this year. Never did anything with it. I had a bad taste in my mouth for years, but I think it was Alan who first said last summer, oh, you said it was you? Didn't you too?
I think I did.
Okay, it was both of you. Anyway,
Great minds think similarly, I'm told.
So the thing is, though, when the book did come out at first, it got great reviews. Publishers Weekly and Kirkus. I put that in your pack, I think, in your package. You can see, maybe not Publishers Weekly, you can see the Kirkus review, and they re-reviewed the new one. They never do second editions, ever. This is the first time I know of it. The president of Kirkus Reviews told his editor-in-chief to do it, and so they did a big interview and released it just...
April.
Yeah, so...
This year.
That was nice. It was a good hit. But at the time, it not only did well with the reviewing journals, page 1 of the New York Times Book Review, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Kennedy's personal assistant and historian, wrote a very favorable review. Page 1, New York Times Book Review. In the media at large, it was a food fight. On the far left, Noam Chomsky said I had vilified Kennedy beyond the wildest dreams of his worst, the opposite. The opposite. He said that I was a hagiographer. That's somebody who makes a saint out of somebody. I was engaging in hagiography. But I had criticized Kennedy because he lied too. He lied about it. And I'll tell you what that is a little bit later in the presentation. But on the far right, Harry Summers and others said that I had vilified Kennedy beyond the wildest dreams of his worst enemies, and so you wondered if they read the same book. So, but a lot of media firestorm. Anyway, at this moment, it had at least 2 years, maybe 3 years had passed since I'd encountered the Mcnamara denial, and I'm in my final year in the Army, tucked away in a really little secret place. Technically an NSA, but it's in reality it's a hip pocket asset of the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence U.S. Army in a little building by Phoenix, the Baltimore Washington Airport. 4 PhDs and 3 secretaries. That's it. We were to plus up any crisis anywhere. I was the guy handling East Asia at the time, and we had a receptionist in the front of the office who wasn't knowledgeable about people with famous names or anything. So one morning I'm sitting there working, and this loud voice comes across the cubicles. Hey, Major Newman, there's some guy named Mcnamara on the phone. And 2 seconds later, the chief of the unit, who is wise, Braxton, he's standing at my desk as I pick up the phone, and it says, hi, this is Bob Mcnamara, I'm ready to talk. Just like that. So something changed his mind. not really sure what, but I'm ready to talk. And I said, well, I'm on duty now, and Braxton's doing this. Go, 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 go. So I did. I got in my car and went down to the World Bank. And we run into trouble there?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to keep going. And so McNamara was there. Jeannie was the secretary. She ushered me in. He was sitting at his desk in a three-piece tweed suit, but he was wearing white sneakers. I could see them under his desk. And so, I saluted. I was in uniform. He's still the Secretary of Defense. And so it didn't take but about 60 seconds before we got into a real argument. He told me that, his reasons for not ever publishing his memoirs on this, and I let him have it. We're both six-shooters. I mean, I didn't yell. I wasn't disrespectful, but I said, that's terrible. You can't do that. Of all people, you're the one who needs to do it. It was his war under JFK and LBJ, after all. And I found out later, really, that he was psychologically, even spiritually sick. If you killed one child with your car by accident, it would stay with you for the rest of your life. Well, 2 million dead Vietnamese and 50,000 dead Americans, not to mention all the maimed people that came out of that war. He was psychosomatically ill, so was his family, and so was his secretary. So I understood why. He thought he would infect us with his disease, and it was something like that, really. The truth was all bottled up deep down inside of him. And so we argued about that, and he said, well, if I'm going to get somebody to help me write my book, I'm going to get a good researcher. So I figured that wouldn't be me. And then we had a good talk about East Asia, which we agreed on a lot of things, and so it ended amicably enough. And so after that, I thought, well, I'm probably not going to see him again, and I was a little bit angry about it, so I called my agent, Sterling Lord, in New York City, and said, I want to change. I was supposed to write a book on Kennedy and Cuba at the time. I said, I want to change the book. He said, to what? And I said, McNamara in Vietnam. He said, John, you should not do that. And I said, why? He said, because McNamara just called. He's going to do his book on Vietnam that morning. And that's how I know. I pushed him over the edge. And things got better. I got to finish this part up. Eventually, he asked me to come over and help him. He and had a really nice guy from the Naval Academy that did most of his, helped him do most of his writing, Brian Vandermark. And Brian and I got along really well. But there was one afternoon that has lived with me ever since it happened. And we were sitting there. I was bringing a lot of documents that I'd collected from all over the country, and we were looking at them, and everything was very quiet. And then he looks up at me, not at me, but like right through me. He's looking right through me, and his eyes are like either glazed over. And he says to me, "When did I know?" Wow. Now, the only person I've ever had that could talk to me like that was Odom. He would put down his paper and say something. "Oh, John, I'm sorry, I could be wrong." And I'd have to connect that to some conversation 2 years before to figure out what the hell he was talking about. But I knew how to do that with Odom, but with McNamara, it was strange for a while, but I got it. I figured it out pretty quickly. What he's doing is he's actually deep in his subconscious, and he's connecting to the very part that I brought to him in the first place, chapter 13. And he says, "When did I know?" And it means, when did I know the truth about the war? And I said, I can't tell you when you knew, but I can tell you when you had the opportunity to. And it was quiet, and he's sitting there. And then he asked me a second question. "Where am I in trouble?" He says, "Where am I in trouble?" Now that was harder to figure out. So it took me a while, I came up with which only a guess, and I will get to it later in the presentation here tonight. 2 days before Kennedy's assassination, due to an assassination of President Diem, a coup in Vietnam, there was a big meeting in Honolulu, a Secretary of Defense conference to decide if policy had to change because of the change of leadership in Vietnam. And it was 2 days before Kennedy was assassinated, and the military put a lot of stuff on the table that would have Americanized the war. And so I said, maybe you should think about what you were doing with the generals out there in Honolulu, and left it at that. Anyway, that was McNamara 2.0. All right, the denial. Years later, he wants to, he wants to talk, and then I help him, and so it ended up being very important. His book did say, in fact, what I knew, that he was pulling out, even if we were losing. So, are you back on track? Okay, good. I think what we need to do is take about a 6 or 7 minute break, and then I'm going to pick up the story about what's really in the book, and then what I figured out for volume 2. Okay, let's take about a little break, stretch your legs.